In the last video, we learned about what a function is and how to define a function that returns a value. In other words, define a function that takes an input and gives an output back. And so we took this function f of x equals x squared plus 2, and given any value of x, it would return or output that value squared plus 2. And we used that function a couple times. Let me talk in this video about the difference between functions that return values and functions that don't return values. And so the way I like to think about it is some functions answer questions, and those questions return values. So in this case, the question might be, what is x squared plus 2? And it gives that back. But other functions just perform commands. And you've seen functions like that, like the print command. You want to just print some information. It's not returning any values, it's just doing something for you. And so I want to kind of draw that distinction today for you and show you how that looks when you're defining functions. So what we did yesterday, or excuse me, in the previous video, was to create a function that answered a question and returned a value. And so we can use that answer by assigning a variable to it, for instance, right? So I could say something like, y equals f of 3, right? And then I could, y would then hold that value. Now I want you to notice something. When we run this, it's going to look like nothing happened. If I look at the shell, nothing printed out, right? But it's not true that nothing happened. It's just that I didn't print anything. And that's a key distinction, right? This function doesn't print anything. It just answers this question, and that answer gets stored in this variable y. So if I were to type y now, my Python shell knows what y is. It's 11, okay? If I wanted to print that in the program itself, I'd have to use a print command, right? So let's look at another example of a function. Let's say we wanted a function called, complement, okay? And it's going to take an input of person, the person we want to complement, okay? Now, in this case, complement doesn't answer a question, it just performs an action. And so that action in this case is going to be to complement. Let's say it will print, what a nice shirt you are wearing. Okay. And so I might say compliment Mr. Miller. And let's see what happens when we run this. Whoops. I said name. It's saying name is not defined because I didn't use the word name. I used person. So it's important that our parameters that we pass in are the same as the parameters that we use in the body of our function. And that was true in this function f of x as well. X was the parameter, and x was the parameter that we used in the function. Now, we could change this. It doesn't have to be x, right? Typically in math it's f of x, but we can make this f of anything, f of n, whatever we like. Just like this, complement of person, and we're going to use the value person. Run that again. And it says, what a nice shirt you're wearing, Mr. Miller, right? Now, what's the difference between that function and the function that we had written earlier, f of x? Well, here's the difference. In this case, I said y equals f of 3, and it made y that value 11. If I say, let's say I want, we'll say c equals complement Mr. Miller. Let's see what c is after we run this again. It compliments me. What a polite program. If I type y, I can see that y is 11. If I type c, it prints nothing. There's nothing there. Why is that? Well, because in this second function, I didn't return a value. And so c doesn't equal anything. C actually equals what's called the none type. It's a none variable. N-O-N-E with a capital N. And so all functions return none unless you tell them to return something else otherwise. And so this is an example of two different kinds of functions. We call functions that return values fruitful functions. You'll see that in the reading. and functions that don't return anything, non-fruitful functions. Okay, and I like to think of them as commands. Hopefully that makes sense. And sometimes you'll want fruitful functions to return values that you're calculating, for instance, and sometimes you'll want non-fruitful functions that just perform a behavior. And you did that actually the first time you programmed when you were using the turtle module and you were drawing. Those functions weren't returning anything. They were simply drawing things to the screen, right? You drew lines or circles, and those were commands, non-fruitful functions. Hopefully that makes sense, and continue on with your work.